the alliance's goal should remain the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, even if this may not seem like a near-term prospect. North Korea has anywhere between 20 and 40 nuclear weapons today. It has fissile material for scores more. It has since the end of the Obama administration, last year the Obama administration and the 4 years of Trump, has tested over 30 ballistic missiles and done a hydrogen bomb test. So this is undeniably a challenge. And while denuclearization may not be a near-term prospect, it still needs to remain the goal of the strategy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Leslie Griffin, a World Boston friend and board member, filling in tonight for our president and CEO, Mary Eintema. The Korean Peninsula is facing a defining era. Although South Korean President Moon and then US President Trump tried to repair the rift between North and South Korea, any and all attempts lost momentum as Pyongyang continued to test long-range missiles for its nuclear weapons program. And as the rift between the United States and China continues to grow, South Korea may end up in the middle and come under increasing pressure to choose sides. What does the future hold for the US relationship with the Republic of Korea? Will reconciliation between the North and South ever be possible? These are just some of the questions we'll explore in tonight's Great Decisions program, The Two Koreas. I am very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Victor Cha. You can read his full bio at worldboston.org. Dr. Victor Cha is Senior Vice President, Senior Advisor, and the inaugural holder of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C. From 2004 to 2007, Dr. Cha served as Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. While at the NSC, Dr. Cha was also the Deputy Head of Delegation for the United States at the Six-Party Talks in Beijing, and received 2 outstanding service commendations during his tenure. Dr. Cha is a former John M. Olin National Security Fellow at Harvard University, a 2-time Fulbright Scholar, a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Scholar at Columbia University, and the holder of multiple fellowships at Stanford University. He currently serves as the Vice Dean for Faculty and Graduate Affairs at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, as well as a contributor for NBC and MSNBC. We are delighted to welcome you to World Boston, Dr. Cha. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for that very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you here this evening. I'm sorry it's not in person. I think as we all wish it would be, but I think we've all become pretty good at this Zoom format. I also want to thank World Boston and the World Affairs Council for hosting the event, as well as the Lowell Institute and the GBH network for hosting all of this. And I too am a strong believer in the World Affairs Council and World Boston, so do contribute. If not based on tonight's presentation, at least based on the previous ones that you've participated in and the future ones that you will participate in. So with that, let me begin. I'm very excited to be here with you this evening to talk about the two Koreas. And as Leslie set up, it's a very interesting time to be studying and thinking about the Korean Peninsula. We have North Korea, which is always interesting, and we'll spend some time talking about this evening. We have a new administration in the United States, obviously, and they're figuring out what their policy should be on the Korean Peninsula. And then we also have a government in South Korea that is coming towards the end of its time in office and is looking to accomplish certain policy objectives with the time that it has left in office. What I thought I'd do this evening was give you sort of an inside the Beltway look at issues on the Korean Peninsula refracted through the prism of the US-Korea alliance relationship. Because in the end, while the headlines about North Korea tend to dominate the media and media consumption when it comes to North Korea. In the end, the most important US national interest on the Korean Peninsula is our alliance with South Korea. And it's been through a rocky period. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and in particular, how people in Washington sort of think and talk about the US Korea alliance and what needs to be done to get it on a good track. So let me begin by saying that overall, the U.S.-Korea relationship South Korea relationship is a very successful relationship. This was an alliance that started in 1953 during a war in which the United States knew very little about Korea, aside from the fact that we wanted to keep it out of the communist camp. And it has since blossomed into a multifaceted, multidimensional economic, security, political, cultural relationship that has provided both security and non-security benefits to both sides. And we can certainly talk about various aspects of that, but I wanted to start with that. Second thing I wanted to say is that South Korea is a vibrant democracy in Asia. It's one of the most vibrant democracies in Asia. It is in political science, it is one of the most peaceful transitions to democracy that we have seen, not just in Asia, but in human history. Up until the 1970s, US government estimates were that the South Korean economy would not advance beyond that of agriculture and light manufactured products. Right? Think about that, agriculture and light manufactured products. Right now, basically every chip in every component of every high-tech device you have is probably made in Korea, and probably at least half of your cell phones are Samsung cell phones, and not even talking about the other appliances in your house, including your TV, probably is a South Korean made. And on the security front, South Korea has been a good ally. It has fought with the United States in every war since the Korean War. And they, along with Australia, are sort of two of the closest military allies that the United States has in Asia. Of course, Japan is another. But in terms of combat, Korea and Australia are two of the most important. So since the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty, this alliance has not only secured peace on the Korean Peninsula, but it has also expanded into becoming a comprehensive partnership that is global in scope, encompassing significant economic and political dimensions beyond security. But the alliance has faced headwinds in recent years that have been generated by the shifting geopolitical dynamics, as Leslie stated, of US-China rivalry, of some nettlesome and troublesome alliance issues, all while there being, I wouldn't say friction, but a bit of dissonance between the two capitals on how to agree on common approaches to major security challenges like North Korea and China. So I'm being very frank. I mean, I think the US-ROK alliance can and needs to perform better. And I think there are a variety of things that can be done to accomplish that objective. The first is, we are now emerging from a period of 4 years where there was a lot that was thrown into flux with regard to US standing and US relationships in the world. And so one of the first things that I think is important for the US-Korea relationship is to reaffirm to the domestic audiences in both countries about the mutual interest in a strong alliance relationship between these two countries, a mutual recognition of enduring interests. I mean, for South Korea, allying with the United States, which is a distant power without any territorial ambitions, has been critical to its ability to prosper in a difficult neighborhood, with China, Russia, Japan, all surrounding the Korean Peninsula. And for the United States, South Korea is a vital partner in dealing with the region's most pressing security challenges, and more broadly in terms of maintaining the open, rules-based liberal order in the Indo-Pacific that has been a foundation for regional peace and stability for the past several decades. So that's very important, reaffirming that to both audiences in the US and in South Korea. Also important is to sort of clear some of the tactical underbrush in the relationship that has troubled the relationship over the last few years, and really focus on what are the important broader challenges. So for Washington and Seoul, there is a need to prevent sort of narrow, contentious issues from defining the alliance in order to refocus attention on broader strategic challenges on the peninsula and in the region. So some of you who follow this a little bit more closely may have remembered that prior to Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin's visit to Korea and Japan a couple of weeks ago, the alliance relationship between the United States and South Korea was wrapped around the axle with regard to one issue that is known as the Special Measures Agreement, which is essentially a negotiation to determine how much South Korea will pay for the non-personnel costs of hosting US forces in Korea. This is a negotiation that takes place usually every 3 to 5 years, and a formula is worked out for cost sharing, what's known as cost sharing or defense burden sharing. No agreement was reached during the Trump administration, in part because of very high demands by the US president for 5 times what South Korea pays about $1 billion for $5 billion for keeping US forces there. And this issue kind of held up the entire alliance relationship for 4 years. So that has been concluded. That was concluded during Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin's trip to Korea. So that's out of the way. But there are other issues that have to do with the command relationships between the two countries, other issues related to military exercising, these sorts of things. These are sort of the smaller issues that we can't allow the alliance narrative to be completely sort of stuck on these issues when there are broader strategic challenges ahead in the alliance. So that's a very important thing for alliance managers, is to get through those difficult issues. Also important is to restore and strengthen US extended deterrence and security commitments to South Korea. These security commitments form the core of the alliance's capacity to maintain peace and stability on the peninsula in the face of the burgeoning North Korean nuclear threat. As we'll talk about in a minute, that threat continues to grow. And as that threat grows, it becomes important for both the United States and South Korea to have confidence in the mutual security guarantees that undergird the alliance. A very important element of this is the presence of 28,500 ground troops and their dependence on the Korean Peninsula. In addition to those 28,500 ground troops and their dependents, there are hundreds of thousands of American expats who live in Korea doing business, making music, making movies. So it's a pretty large contingent. And this presence, this live presence of the United States in Korea comprises what Joseph Nye at Harvard once described as a community of fate that is shared with South Koreans, in the sense that this US presence is the most meaningful indicator of the US resolve never to decouple from its alliance partner. So strengthening extended deterrence means reaffirming that presence, but also means other things in terms of increasing the tangibility of US extended deterrence through senior level military exchanges, confidence building measures, upgrading and coordination of defense capabilities, and reinstating certain dialogues that were suspended over the past 4 years, including the extended deterrence strategy dialogue. So an alliance is worth as much as there is confidence in the security commitments on both sides. And so this is a very important element. The third point would be about thinking about how the alliance is important for the US and Korea off of the peninsula. And probably in this regard, the most significant and inadequately addressed challenge to the long-term resiliency of the alliance has to do with how to respond to China's growing assertiveness in the region. The United States and South Korea have to devise a new framework that allows Seoul's economic equities, as well as its North Korea-related equities in its ties with China, but at the same time also pushes back against China as a large and sometimes bullying neighbor. And so in this regard, I think one of the things that's important is for the United States and South Korea to rewrite old narratives of the alliance sort of serving some type of anti-China purpose, with a much more positive and forward-looking and principles-based framework for working together to shape a resilient Asia. And by resilient Asia, I mean an Asia that is secured its supply chains, that has clean next generation wireless networks, that believes in robust democracy, freedom of navigation, human rights, all these sorts of things that, again, sort of celebrates the alliance as a key component of maintaining the rules-based international order. And this is not just related to political issues, it's also related to global governance issues, where the US and South Korea could work together multilaterally to aid countries that are targeted economically by China with measures that violate the letter and the spirit of the World Trade Organization. Japan is a core member of this resilient Asia, sharing US values, US and South Korean values of democracy, freedom, human rights, and market economy, as well as common strategic interests. Closer trilateral cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea is a force multiplier, to use a Pentagon term, not just in security challenges, but across the spectrum, whether you're talking about climate mitigation or economic global governance issues, regional infrastructure and economic development, public health. There's real potential there for growth. And then finally, broadening the aperture of the alliance is important. Given the many global challenges in the world today, the alliance needs to broaden its base to perform at its peak levels. And this means really trying to realize the alliance's global potential as a public goods provider, right? Not just an alliance that provides private security benefits to the United States and South Korea, to Americans and South Koreans, but an alliance that also provides public goods at a global level. And so this means things like greater cooperation with regard to space, with regard to cybersecurity, as I mentioned before, with regard to public health, energy, the environment, the fourth industrial revolution. These are all areas of deep expertise for both countries that engage newer and younger constituencies in generating new commercial opportunities and high-paying, high-skilled jobs. In this broadening of the alliance, it's also important to operationalize common values as a core foundation of the alliance, to support the liberal rules-based international order in organizations such as the Democracies 10, something the Biden administration has talked about. And there's also great opportunity to coordinate development policies bilaterally and multilaterally, including with Japan and Australia, to promote transparent, socially responsible, and environmentally friendly infrastructure and development assistance projects. So again, I mean, there is a lot of positive, there's a lot of good news when it comes to the alliance relationship. And with a new administration in South Korea, there's plenty of opportunity. I'm sorry, a new administration in the United States, there's plenty of opportunity to pursue these sorts of objectives. And so that takes us to North Korea. And so I wanted to start out with the good news before getting to the bad news. Well, maybe I shouldn't put it so bleakly, but The first thing is that, so the threat posed or presented by North Korea's nuclear weapons is more serious than ever. As I have said before and written before, North Korea is unfortunately in the policy world, the land of lousy options, in the sense that there is no perfect approach to dealing with North Korea. There are only a handful of suboptimal alternatives. And so going forward, the most effective approach or policy or strategy should not depart from several core principles. The first is that the alliance's goal should remain the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, even if this may not seem like a near-term prospect. North Korea has anywhere between 20 and 40 nuclear weapons today. It has fissile material for scores more. It has since the end of the Obama administration, last year, the Obama administration and the 4 years of Trump has tested over 30 ballistic missiles and done a hydrogen bomb test. So this is undeniably a challenge. And while denuclearization may not be a near-term prospect, it still needs to remain the goal of the strategy. In the interim, the focus should be, or energy should be put towards stopping further growth in North Korea's nuclear program and trying to manage the threat. Because even though there were 3 summit meetings that took place between the US and the North Korean leaders in 2018 and 2019, during this period, North Korea continued to develop their capabilities, even though they may not have tested them all. And as they demonstrated at their military parade in January, they are developing longer and larger weapons that are threatening to the United States. Third, I mean, negotiations with North Korea are important. They're integral to the process of denuclearization, but they shouldn't come at the expense of US allies and should be closely coordinated with them. We went through a period of time where the United States came out of these summit meetings with North Korea, having promised things to the North Koreans without really coordinating with any of the parties, or for that matter, not even coordinating within the US government. And that creates consternation all the way around, because in the end, as I said from the start, our most important equity on the Korean Peninsula is our alliance with the South. It's not a difficult and unpredictable negotiation with the North. Fourth, I think it's important to mention that addressing human rights abuses in North Korea is something that the United States, even more so than South Korea, has been willing to do under the Biden administration. We've seen a number of statements already by Secretary Blinken on this. And I think that is requisite to any improvement in US North Korean political relations. Because even as we move forward on the nuclear issue, it's difficult to imagine a normal political relationship happening between the United States and North Korea. I mean, remember, the United States and North Korea are still adversaries. The war on the Korean Peninsula has never ended yet with a peace treaty. There is only a ceasefire since 1953 that's in place. So a part of normalizing that political relationship is denuclearization, but also another part of it is addressing the human rights abuses in North Korea, which are among the worst in modern human history. The only reason you don't hear about it as much is because it is nameless and faceless. It's a bunch of statistics, such as 10% of the population died of economic mismanagement in the mid-1990s, thousands, if not tens of thousands, in gulags and concentration camps. These are nameless and faceless statistics because the regime is so opaque, it doesn't let anybody in. But it is one of the worst human rights disasters in modern history, and it's very difficult to imagine the United States and North Korea improving relations without addressing this. And then finally, at the same time, the United States should support efforts by the South Korean government to engage with its northern neighbor, particularly in humanitarian areas. with the understanding that these policies would have to be aligned with the denuclearization negotiations and aligned with UN Security Council sanctions requirements, because there are a bevy of UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea today. I'm certainly happy to talk more about this and the road forward on North Korea, but let me just conclude by saying, again, from where I started, the US-South Korea alliance is a very important one for the United States. It is an alliance that can maximize its vast potential on the peninsula, in the region, and in the world, and that could help to form the core of multiple coalitions of countries that share the conviction that an open, rules-based order presents the most reliable and effective pathway towards regional, global, and peace and prosperity for decades to come. So thank you all for your attention. I look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn it back to Leslie.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that thought-provoking discussion. I suspect we're going to have a lot of questions coming to you shortly. I do see a couple of questions coming into the chat, so just a reminder to please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And on that note, I see a very good friend of World Boston has raised his hand for a question. Raul Alcala, could you please ask your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very illuminating presentation, Dr. Cha. My question has to do with the United Nations and Russia. As you noted, we still don't have peace. 70 years on, there's still a United Nations command, nominal though it may be, in South Korea, and the Russians are a looming presence just around the corner. So what importance is there to this continuation of the UN command and Russia in the neighborhood?
Well, thanks for the question, Raul. So as you have rightly stated, I mean, if any of you have been to the demilitarized zone in North Korea, it's kind of like a time warp, because it's sort of a piece of history that's been frozen in time, right? The Cold War. And it's still that way. It's one of the most militarized borders in the world. And the United Nations Command, right, which was established during the war, and is still in existence there. I would say that it's still important in the sense that if, God forbid, there were another military contingency, another invasion by North Korea of South Korea, that United Nations Command is a very important body, both on the peninsula, but also in terms of assets that would be brought to bear from off the peninsula, whether it's coming from California or whether it's coming from Japan. And so the United Nations Command may sound like something that's a time warp from the Korean War, but it still plays a very important role, a very important military role in terms of the continued strength of the alliance relationship. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that one of the issues that the US and South Korea are talking about today is transfer of the command relationship, the wartime command relationship, to a South Korean general. Currently, it's a US general who's also dual-hatted as head of the United Nations Command. I think both the South Koreans and the United States, and the Japanese for that matter, believe that should that command transfer to a South Korean general, both sides, all three sides, still believe the United Nations Command is important to have as a structure for managing in the event that there were actually another conflict on the peninsula.
What about the Russians?
Oh, I'm sorry. So as you know well, the Russians played an important role with regard to, in two respects, with regard to the invasion in 1950, because they were not there and could not veto the United Nations resolution to go to war in defense of South Korea. But they did provide a great deal of technical assistance to North Korea, and Stalin played a very important role with regard to Kim Il-sung's decision to invade the South. Today, the Russian role is really focused much more on commercial opportunities. They, for the longest time, have sought two things. One is to physically connect the transport infrastructure of the Korean Peninsula to the Russian Far East, as well as the energy infrastructure to the Russian Far East. And so for that reason, in negotiations that I've been in with regard to North Korean denuclearization, Russia's questions, the role that they play, in the end, it's entirely focused on how to get to those two objectives: infrastructure development that will enable a connection between the Russian Far East with the Korean Peninsula, East Asia, and Japan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. And next we have a question from another very good friend of World Boston, Mary Mendoza. Mary, can I ask you to turn your camera on? Pose your question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, this particular presidency is a little bit different from the prior one.
Just a little.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump's 4 years of chaos, lack of planning, where he seemed to give Kim Jong-un a lot of recognition without really getting much from him in return. How much did all that just lack of chaos and planning and just plain old foolishness, how much damage did that do to the relationship between North Korea and the US and the possibilities of getting anything out of it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mary. You know, I think, you know, when Trump and Kim Jong-un held their first summit in Singapore, I think all of us probably remember that in 2018. And a lot of people ridiculed it. You know, they said Trump wasn't ready, and Kim Jong-un was having a great time walking around Singapore. You know, this is a reclusive leader. This was his first trip since becoming leader of the country outside of North Korea. But I was actually one of the few people, talking heads, if you will, that was positive on it, in the sense that, as a former negotiator, this was the first time that we were truly testing the hypothesis that if you're dealing with a dictatorship, you got to deal with the dictator, right? I mean, up until this point, all the negotiations took place at my level, right? The sort of expert level. And every time we got an agreement with North Korea and we tried to spin it to the New York Times, right? The question we'd always get back is, well, has the North Korean leader signed off on this? And we're like, no, I mean, we negotiated this at the working level. And then they would be like, well, how do you know they're going to abide by it? So the one hypothesis that, you know, Trump's first summit in Singapore with Kim was testing was, is this going to work, right? Is this talking to the leader directly? Is this going to work? And so I was not negative on it. Now, having said that, we saw with Summit number 2 and Summit number 3, there was no progress being made at all, because there was no follow-up at the working level after the two leaders had met. There was no work plan that had been negotiated between the two sides in advance of the summit that they could then roll out after the summit. It was just about the made-for-TV moments that the president was interested in. And so while all that was happening, North Korea, behind the scenes, was continuing to make more nuclear weapons, improving their missile capability, improving their short range, their medium range, their long range missile capability, the explosive yield of their nuclear weapons, all these sorts of continuing cyber activities, all these sorts of things. So in the end, one could be positive about the effort, but what happened was you had the worst of both worlds, because at the diplomacy level, it looked like progress was being made, but at the actual level, the situation was getting worse, right? Because their capabilities were growing, and we had a U.S. president that wouldn't even acknowledge that this was what was happening. And so in the end, I think everybody would agree that we were worse off at the end than we were at the start. And this is what has been left for the Biden administration to deal with, right? So.
Thank you for your question, Mary. And next we're going to hear from Ed Martins. Ed, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, again, Doctor, thank you very much for your talk here. I'd like to go back to the role of China, which seems to be North Korea's only friend in the world, or friend of any significance. I wonder what their concerns are, because I remember we had an expert several years ago, and I asked him what South Korea's plan was if 10 million hungry North Koreans walk into Seoul, and he said they can't cross the DMZ. They're going to go to China. So what is China doing, and do they worry about what they see in the future? What do they just hope that things just keep going along? Do they see an end? Will they try to maybe push some kind of reform in North Korea so they don't have, however many millions of North Koreans are all starving to death and showing up in China? What is China's plan?
Yeah.
What do you think of China's plans are?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Edward. There are a couple of things, a couple of reactions. The first is that sort of at the broader strategic level, China doesn't want North Korea to disappear, right? If North Korea disappears and it gets absorbed by South Korea, both historically and strategically, China worries about an adversary on its southern flank. In this case, that would be a US military ally. And so just geostrategically, they don't want to see North Korea disappear. They want to keep it. They want to keep it afloat. Having said that, as your question stated, they would like to see North Korea reform, right? We have, one of my hats, as Leslie mentioned, is at CSIS, a think tank in Washington, DC. And one of the things we did there was collect data on all the places that Chinese leaders have taken the North Korean leader every time they visited China, right? And we actually have a map of this where all the different places. And when you look, it's an interactive map. You can click on a dot and it'll say which North Korean leader and what they visited. And when you look at that over the years, it's just so obvious what the Chinese are doing, right? Because they're taking him to a cell phone manufacturing plant. They're taking to a car plant, to a textiles plant. They're taking him to all these places saying, you need to reform economically, right? You have cheap literate labor. You need to reform economically, like China, like Vietnam, other places. And the North Korean regime just hasn't done it. So China has tried, but the North Korean regime just has not been interested in reforming because they're afraid of losing control, right? They're basically afraid of losing control. So what the Chinese are stuck with is they're stuck with a situation where they don't want the regime to collapse. They can't get it to reform. And so they end up sort of in this narrow band where when it looks like it's about to collapse, they will funnel food and energy to it. And when it looks like it's going to provoke a war with the United States by firing intercontinental ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons, they sort of slap North Korea on the hand and sort of do these unwritten sanctions, nothing complying with the UN resolutions, but doing their own sort of bilateral sanctions to try to keep the North Koreans in line, right? So I would imagine if for the Chinese, it's a very frustrating place to be. And you would think that that would then offer opportunities for cooperation with the United States. And it does in a limited capacity, but it doesn't in the long term, in the sense that our main concern is denuclearization, and then after that, unification, right, of the Korean Peninsula. And for China, it's not those things. It's avoiding a crisis, avoiding collapse. Those are the two things that they are concerned with. So there's some small tactical overlap between the United States and China on North Korea, but there isn't the broad strategic overlap.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe I'll go ahead and throw a question in. So I woke up this morning to the news of 2 mayoral races in Korea's 2 largest cities, in Seoul and in Busan. And it looks like the main opposition party, the Conservative Party, won big in both of those mayoral races, which is sort of a big change from the landslide win that President Moon's party had about a year ago in the midterm elections. And a lot of the media coverage of those races talked about this being a bellwether for the presidential elections in March next year. So if that is the case, and we may be looking in the early part of next year to a conservative government in Seoul, can you just talk a little bit about the implications of that for these issues that we're talking about in terms of the ability to collaborate on these issues?
Sure, yeah. So the first thing I would say is that we have to understand what progressive and conservative mean in the South Korean political context, right? When we're talking about progressives, we're not talking about it. We're not talking about pro-choice or pro-gay marriage. We're really talking about a policy of engagement with North Korea. And when we're talking about conservatives in South Korea, we're talking about very pro-alliance, more skeptical of engagement, not against, but more skeptical of engagement with North Korea, and more skeptical of the relationship with China, right? And so, as you mentioned, there were two by-elections that took place in the two biggest cities for the mayors of the two biggest cities in South Korea, Seoul and Busan. And both of these were won pretty much in a landslide by the opposition party, which is the Conservative Party. In South Korea, the presidency is a single five-year, one-term presidency, and Moon has about, the current president has 11 months left. So having lost these two key mayoral races in the two biggest cities to the opposition, I think a lot of commentary is that he's now effectively a lame duck, given only 11 months left. And then, essentially after these by-elections, the informal presidential campaign will start from tomorrow, right? And so if there were, I have to be careful about the way I say this, because I think that if there were a change of party in South Korea to a conservative one, the US-South Korean relationship on a variety of issues might become a little bit easier. There probably would be more South Korean interest in things like the Quad, right? The US, Australia, India, Japan dialogue. There would be certainly interest in things like clean 5G networks, absent potential penetration by China. There would be interest in resilient supply chains. Like Korea is actually very important for a supply chain among democracies, with the United States and Japan at one end, Mexico, Vietnam at the other, and South Korea being in a very important middle piece for that. So there'd be a lot of things that would be positive and that could move forward. But I hesitate to characterize it too starkly, because I'm not saying that if a progressive government were to win again, that would mean the alliance would be in deep trouble. I mean, the last time I was in government, I worked for a pretty conservative president, and the government in South Korea was a progressive government, right? But then we still did an FTA with South Korea. They contributed troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. We did climate change initiatives with them. There are a lot of things that can be done. But it would definitely have a different feel to it, for sure.
Thank you very much. And looks like we now have a question from Friedrich. I'm gonna ask you to turn your camera on and unmute and ask your question.
When I'm looking at listening to recent moves, test statements made by the North Korean side, including Kim Jong-un's sister, all this sounds and reads a little bit familiar. Would you think that what the North Koreans have been doing now is to return to their old playbook that ends with obtaining concessions for just negotiations, but not for real concessions, in order to get, material help, as you mentioned, but not in order to move in any way forward towards a real settlement of the nuclear question in North Korea?
So thank you, Friedrich, for that question. In fact, the words that you use sort of from the same playbook, I was actually just talking to somebody in the government today about this, and I use those very same words, right? They're playing from the same playbook, in the sense that, so again, we have data that shows North Korea likes to ratchet up the pressure anytime a new U.S. administration comes into office. So if you actually look at this over time, there is a higher propensity for North Korea to do provocations in U.S. presidential election years and in by-election year and in midterm election years than not. Right? There's a much higher concentration of provocations, and there's also a higher concentration of them in the initial months after the inauguration of a new U.S. president. When President Obama was inaugurated, I think it was 5 weeks before North Korea did a rocket test, and then maybe 8 weeks before a nuclear test. And under Trump, it was even less. When North Korea started, in fact, during Trump's first year, they did 20 ballistic missile tests and a hydrogen bomb test. And, so true to form, they've, made some pretty tough statements. As you said, the younger sister of Kim Jong-un has made some pretty tough statements. And they've already done 2 projectile launches and 2 ballistic missile tests. And we had a report come out on NBC News last week that shows they may be reprocessing plutonium again at the nuclear reactor in Yongbyon for, to make more bombs. So this is, the way I like to say it is, North Korea is opaque, but they are entirely predictable in the sense that this is a strategy. And at the same time, as you said, what's the purpose of it? It's not that they want to get into a negotiation to give up their weapons. They want to negotiate their place at the table, right, in order to get concessions for them to come to the table, right? And then certainly to engage in negotiation where they might rent a temporary freeze on their programs or things of that nature, but never ultimately give up their weapons.
We have a history of using sanctions as a tool of diplomacy, and it's been a failure, at least in my view. And so one might ask, if the stick doesn't work, maybe the carrot might work better. And I was wondering what you think about the possibility of using a re-entry into the Pan-Pacific Treaty and even possibly affiliating with the Chinese version of it that they've instituted, with South Korea working with us to try to bring North Korea into trade relationships that might improve their economic situation, which would take a lot of stress off their country. It might even improve the cyber situation that we have with them. And so, in terms of cyber theft. So I'm thinking that if you're starting with a blank slate with a new president, would you advise President Biden to go in that direction?
So thanks for the question. So I would say that every U.S. administration, I think, including this one, understands that the diplomatic toolkit with regard to North Korea is not just sanctions. I mean, administrations have ended up doing only sanctions. Like the Obama administration finished 2 terms in office, ending up just doing sanctions. And the Trump administration finished ending up just doing sanctions. But they've all started out looking at not just sanctions, but also diplomacy to try to open up North Korea. And I've been at the table, across from them with instructions about engagement, as have many of my predecessors and people who followed me, where we have talked about connecting them to the most vibrant economic arena of the world. I mean, maybe some of you have seen that famous National Geographic satellite picture at night of East Asia, where everything is lit up, is brightly lit, right, in city lights, and there's one black hole in the middle of the map, right, and that is North Korea. So we've showed them that map and said, you can connect to all of this, right, and we, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese can all help you connect to this if you're interested in it. And the answer is always that they're interested, but they're interested in having their cake and eating it too, right? They're interested in all of the benefits that come from connecting with the economies of East Asia. But they want to do that while retaining a nuclear weapons capability outside of the NPT regime without inspections of any sort, right? And so that's a hard pill for any administration to swallow. I think it's a hard pill even for a progressive government in South Korea to swallow, and it's definitely a hard pill for the Japanese to swallow. I agree with you that sanctions are important. They have a limited capacity. What I believe sanctions do is sanctions, if they are painful enough, help to bring North Korea to the table without having to pay for them to come to the table. But sanctions alone will not get us to an agreement, right? It requires diplomacy, it requires incentives. You know, there's academic literature that says that sanctions work best. Actually, there's academic literature that says sanctions work best between democracies that know each other as a tool of diplomacy. They don't work very well when you're talking about countries that are not, dyads where one country is not a democracy and the two have an adversarial relationship, right? So there's literature to that effect. So I think your point is well taken, and I think every administration starts out wanting to try to use a combination of the two.
Thank you for that question. And next, I see World Boston friend and my friend, Heather O'Brien. Do you want to turn on your microphone and camera, please?
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Cha. I loved your presentation. And I definitely agree. Being in the DMZ there is one of the most tense DMZs I've ever been in. So really a memorable experience. So two-part question, please. One, as far as forward military posture goes, you know, we tried to introduce the THAAD missile system and radar system and got quite a reaction from China, in that they also sanctioned South Korean grocery stores and grocery chains and really made a big economic impact there. So how do we continue our growing our military posture there and new initiatives so that most importantly we back our diplomatic efforts, which you know is the most important part of any peaceful solution? And how do we bring North Korea gently to the table when we have already made overtures toward them in our new administration, and yet Kim Jong-un is not willing to come to the table? So how can those two parts work together, please? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and you definitely had the best background of the evening. So, so on the first point, yes, I mean, China has a practice of when they don't like what countries in the region do, they try to isolate them bilaterally and then squeeze them economically, right? And so they did this in response to South Korea deploying a missile defense system, a US missile defense system. They did it to Japan by stopping the export of rare earth minerals. They did it to the NBA, the National Basketball Association, when a manager on the Houston Rockets posted on Twitter support for the Hong Kong democracy activists. I mean, it's pretty, they did it to the Philippines on bananas. They did it to Norway with regard to salmon, and the Nobel Peace Prize that was given to a Chinese poet, dissident writer. So this is standard Chinese practice, and it is intimidating to every country. And so the answer there from a US perspective, and I think we're seeing it from the Biden administration, is that for all these countries in Asia, you cannot deal with China on your own, right? It's just too big. And if they take these sorts of predatory activities, you need to be with a group. And so I think all of these efforts, whether it's the Quad or the Democracy 10 or resilient supply chains, are all aimed at trying to build a coalition so that people don't have to suffer by themselves, right? There's a group. On the second point with regard to bringing North Korea to the table, what can be done? So the variable here that we haven't talked about tonight, but that I think is new and important, is the impact of COVID on North Korea. Not in the sense that there's widespread COVID in the country, because apparently there's not. because they're so isolated anyway. But in the sense that in their precautions to prevent COVID from coming into their country, which would be a total disaster because they don't have a public health infrastructure to speak of, they have completely sealed the border with China. So 90% of North Korea's external trade is with one country, and that's China. And since they've sealed the border now for 14 months. Year-on-year trade, bilateral trade with China is down like 85%, which means there's no foreign currency reserves. You know, this is real. We were talking earlier about sanctions. This is about the most harsh sanctions that could be imposed on North Korea by the North Koreans themselves, right? And so the question is like, is there a humanitarian carrot that can bring the North Koreans out? Whether it's COVAX, vaccines from COVAX, right, of the World Health Organization, whether it's even online communication about public health, right? What can be done to improve the public health infrastructure in North Korea? You know, that may be because right now for the U.S. to say, all right, we're going to lift sanctions, it means nothing to North Korea because they're not going to open their borders because of COVID. So really, this is a variable we don't know a lot about, and we don't know whether there's an opportunity there, and it's not clear that they've been asked yet. So that would be one place to explore.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, with that, I think we are going to bring our evening to a close. That was a super conversation. You made a very complicated landscape very interesting and accessible. We thank you for your time tonight. We will be watching for your future papers. Maybe we'll catch you on NBC or MSNBC and hear your latest thoughts on these topics. So I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience members. We had a great set of questions. So with that, please everyone have a good night, and thank you again to Dr. Cha.